All right, thank you so much for joining me. Does everybody have a microphone?
Yes.
We're all good. Welcome back. And yeah, please give my panel a round of applause. Welcome. It's super rare that we build a feature like this and we end up getting every single person that we wanted to sit in on the panel. I don't know how we did it, but it all came together so nicely. So thank you all for joining me, and thank you for attending the conference. I hope it's been worth your while. Aside from Rob, you've all traveled here from somewhere else. Now, I want to kick this panel off with a question for you, JR. The title of this panel is Psychedelic Renaissance. And that's because we're seeing a flood of capital interest, a surge of entrepreneurship, lots of activity in this space. I see these cycles every year. We build these shows all over the place. They're annual. So I'm very familiar with hype cycles that don't have legs. Now, what leads you, but you're building a long-term business model. Obviously, you're making a long-term bet. What about this tells you that this conversation has longevity?
I mean, obviously there's always hype cycles in any industry. I don't think we're in hype cycle on this space yet by any means. But I would say, look, there's patients out there. There's big problems that we're solving in depression and addiction. These problems aren't going away. It's going to be a long-term business. And so, yeah, it can go up and down, but people are still sick, and we need to help them.
Agreed. And Dr. Dennis McKenna, you've seen this before. What do you think is different today from the resurgence or the surge that we experienced in the 60s and 70s? How is today different, and how will the future be different?
Well, I think what's different now, the main thing that's different now, when psychedelics sort of first came on the scene back in the 60s, we didn't have any experience with it as a society. LSD kind of dropped like a bomb into society. We didn't know what to do with it. It became a focus for social disruption in some ways, and it was sorely needed social disruption. But I think the short answer is in the 40 years or so that's passed since then, we've learned about how to use psychedelics. They've been around for a while, even though they've been underground. I think we built a knowledge base now, so they're not so scary. We've developed ways to use them, borrowing from clinical practice and traditional practices. So we're in a much better position to create this new paradigm and make it last this time, and so I think that's the main thing, that's what's different this time around.
Dr. Johnson, anything that you'd add to that?
Well, that and the science that's been progressing in the background. I've been doing work in this area for 15 years. Broadly speaking, it's been about 20 years since this modern renaissance, if you want to call it that, has started. So it's really just a few labs that have been, working over the last, 15, 10 years or so, and that's rapidly expanding. And we're getting dramatic, large effects on the most intractable disorders. Right. So that's very different. And we also have an appreciation for the real risks of these compounds. We have an understanding of what those risks are, what they're not. Right. And importantly, we have methods of squarely mitigating the very well-known risks in clinical research and in potential future clinical use. So we have the lessons of the past that we've learned from. We're not advocating that everyone should be using these compounds. There are dangers. And also right now, the final factor is that there's this unprecedented level of need. Addiction, opioids, but then, gosh, tobacco and alcohol swamp all the other ones combined in terms of deaths. So we have addiction crisis altogether, and that with suicidality from depression, we've got a lot of people we need to help.
Sure, and then I'll just stick with you for a second because one of the most credible developments in this space is your new facility. And the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University, I believe fully funded now for 5 years, and some heavyweight investors backing this. And it's a nonprofit, they're writing massive checks. Can you update our audience on what you're up to and what the purpose of this new facility is?
Right, we're very thankful to have received recently a $17 million a gift that's going to fund our center for the next 5 years. Half that money is coming from the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, and the other half is a small group of investors that Tim Ferriss has led. Tim and really all of the investors have very much seen this as the biggest area where one can leverage a relatively small amount of money to impact the greatest change possible. Looking at the results that we've published, and if we have a moment at some point, I just have a couple of slides I can show you all the type of results we're talking about.
Why don't we pull them up right now, please, AV?
But if these results hold up, I mean, we're talking about a revolution in mental health care. So these are just some publications on safety. We're the experts on the good, the bad, the ugly. Over 10 years ago, I published a kind of the Bible of how to conduct this research safely, and I now know that the FDA is saying they're using this to evaluate new protocols. We recently wrote a review on what the risks are and what schedule psilocybin should be, and if it's approved as medicine. We concluded Schedule 4. But the data really on the next slide, if you can go to that, these are our cancer results with our 51 cancer patients. This is the most rigorous, largest study for a clinical disorder, double-blind, that's been conducted in the modern era with psychedelics. On the leftmost points for both anxiety and depression, these patients were scoring in extremely clinically severe territory. The red folks are the folks that got psilocybin in their first session. Everyone had 2 sessions. The other people had a trivial dose, really essentially a placebo. Those are the people in the blue. And there were dramatic reductions 5 weeks post-1 on the x-axis. That's 5 weeks after the first session. So this is over a month later. Depression scores have plummeted to normal levels, I mean, where you're not diagnosing a disorder anymore. A reduction in the other group, not nearly as large, probably from what we call placebo effect and the very strong rapport building and discussion. But then everyone receives the high dose, so they receive the reverse condition from the initial time. So now the blue group has gotten a high dose at the post-2. Now you can see the blue group, their depression levels is all the way down to that subclinical level. And then the crazy thing is 6 months later, these results from a single high-dose session have remained plummeted. Nearly identical results for anxiety, you can see on the graph on the right. And so, I think ketamine has legitimately been considered a breakthrough in the treatment of depression for effects that typically last 1 week, immediate effects that last 1 week. We're seeing results that last 6 months. And to be clear, it's not like they go back after 6 months. This is just as long out as we've looked.
Right.
So we need to keep following the data, but these are as promising as I've ever seen in the treatment of a psychiatric disorder. And from 1 dose, I mean, it's unheard of. And I can show you smoking results much more briefly in the next slide if you want to jump to that. Just in 6 months from our open label pilot of 15 treatment resistor smokers on average smoking 30 years a pack a day, psilocybin plus cognitive behavioral therapy, 80% of participants were biologically verified as smoke-free 6 months later. This absolutely dwarfs everything else that has been ever published in the field. The very best medication, varenicline or Chantix, gets up around 35% at 6 months. So we're following up now in a large randomized trial. We're still more than doubling the long-term success of nicotine replacement.
Now, could you provide some context on that? Because, it's outstanding results. There it is. Thank you so much. And congratulations.
I'd like to
Dr. McKenna, please.
Question of Dr. Johnson. Yeah, congratulations on your grant. This should have been happened a long time ago. Just speaking to the point that you made, and I didn't mean to exclude it, the fact that it's rigorous science and the public respects science, and what was lacking back in the day, there was research, but it was not as rigorous and well done as is being done now. And one of my questions was, after your initial tobacco study, I understand you approached NIDA for funding, saying these are preliminary results, but would you consider funding bigger studies? And the answer was basically no way, no how, we don't even want to hear about it. Has that changed now? Will the government get involved with providing funding, giving these spectacular results?
I think it's extremely promising. I've been in conversations with individuals at NIH. They are interested. I think we're seeing a sea change. I think it is shifting from the traditional concern has been an NIH institute director is before Congress, and they're afraid the question from the congressman is going to be, don't you know about the history of Tim Leary? What the hell are you thinking funding psychedelic research? I think now the question is going to be, don't you know about the opioid crisis? Don't you know about the PTSD crisis?
Right.
All the suicides? These promising results from places like Johns Hopkins, NYU, UCLA. Why the hell haven't you funded any of this psychedelic research? And so, NIDA says they're interested, the Drug Abuse Institute. I'm going to be putting the next phase of the smoking line of research in as a grant to them. And they say there's an openness there.
Well, good luck.
Thank
and
you.
if they reject it, everyone should write their congressman. I mean, I realize we're in Canada, but still.
Now, JR, you have secured government funding for MindMed, have you not?
So the 18MC project, which is a big part of MindMed, received $6.7 million in a NIDA grant looking at for its anti-addictive properties. And I think part of the reason was we were not, it wasn't trip-based psychotherapy. And when we received that was a few years back. But now there's this, like you said before, there's a bit of a renaissance here. And I think that NIDA does need to look at all different types of psychedelics, both psychedelic-inspired medicines and also these trip-based psychotherapies. Why shouldn't they? There's problems. There's people dying, and there's 11 million people misusing their opioids out there. So we got to try everything, and I hope they give MATA a grant.
Yeah, absolutely, me too. Now, Rob, you have been on the front lines of prohibition for a long time. Starting, we met through the cannabis industry a handful of years back. Can you describe the landscape today? And let's stay with psilocybin, right? What are the laws telling us? Because it's readily available if you look. You don't have to look that hard.
Yeah, well, being a lawyer gives you the advantage of you get to see both sides of the law. What the law is and, what the law should be. And you see a lot of what the law should be in Vancouver. I mean, very recently there was the commencement of effectively an online psilocybin dispensary. Not licensed, but it's because the spectrum or the pendulum has swung so far the other way that opioids and addiction and other methods of harm reduction this is why psychedelics are looking so good. And in fact, the cannabis experiment in Vancouver, going back to, let's say, 2015, when the city of Vancouver decided to license, that wasn't just out of a tradition of, without considering previous harm reduction. You have to remember Vancouver had safe injection sites. And so a lot of the cannabis litigation comes, of course, from safe injection sites. And in those instances, you'd have City of Vancouver trying to address a public health issue to also engage in strategies that will, again, enhance public safety. And so we have, not far from here, probably the worst zip code in North America, known as the downtown east side. And being a lawyer that has operated a lot in that neighborhood, it's wonderful to see the addition of, or the consideration of psychedelics in use. And in fact, a lot of people know the name Mark Emery. But Mark Emery, prior to the cannabis culture, was actually one of the earliest people that I'm aware of who was doing types of iboga, ibogaine treatment. Now again, very different than what JR is doing and so on, but again, it's out of that tradition of, addressing public harm and so on. So to sum up my point of view on this, you're seeing now folks like Dana Larson and his dispensary, which had to close at one location, they do testing now. And the cool thing is this is a long-term, maybe 20-something year dispensary, had to close because of the regulations, reinvented itself as a testing source, and now they've been granted emergency powers under the provincial government health to do the work that they're doing. So yeah, how has it changed? It's changed because the only way we're going to solve these problems is by learning from the work that Dr. Johnson is doing, as well as the folks like Dennis who've been pioneers, along with the next generation work that Lars and JR and Ronan are doing. So I mean, who knows what the strategy is, but now we can talk about it, and governments are seeing it as a means to address these ugly ills that Dr. Johnson discussed.
Dr. Johnson, did you have something to add there? You're grabbing your mic. I thought you had something to say.
No, I mean, I agree. I think, now is the time. I think there's a lot to, we're going to see such dramatic changes over the next several years. I think some of it's going to be unpredictable in terms of what it's going to look like, but I think it's pretty safe to predict there is going to be some dramatic change.
What do you think it should look like? And I'll divert to you, Lars. Best case scenario, what's the legalization picture look like on a global level?
Well, I think if I look at Europe, for example, and we can't even wrap our heads around legalizing cannabis. I think legalizing psychedelics just like that in Europe is a long way off. I think the decriminalization movement in the US will continue, and I think there are similarities in Canada. But as I said earlier, let's first focus on the people that need it most. We're in a global mental health crisis, which I think is a societal crisis. We have 55,000 suicide attempts a day. If you think about it, and one thing that I like typically to do with audiences, and if you don't mind and give me 20 seconds, I would like to try that here, is to invite everyone to close their eyes. And if you have suffered from a mental health disorder, I would kindly ask you to raise your hand right now. If you have someone in your family that had suffered from a mental health disorder, please raise your hand right now. And now open your eyes and look around. So what that tells you is that no one is untouched. Everyone knows someone who has suffered from depression, anxiety, OCD, and worse. And so, that's the focus. And I think if we think about that, right, our current focus is treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. TRD, that's 100 million patients. Overall depression is 300 million. Anxiety is 700 million people. And if you add up those numbers, you very quickly realize that 1 in 4 people on this planet are suffering from any type of mental health disorder, which means that the medical route, is the way that will allow patients and people to access psychedelics in first place. And once our society can wrap their head around that this can be administered in a safe way and more people have had those experiences, I think that opens up a very easy route to legalization. And so that's where I think will happen in the next 10 years. But the medicalization is the entry point to that.
Okay, thank you. Now, what do you say to challengers of legalization and decriminalization? And I'll just throw this out to the panel. This is a controversial topic still, and I'm sure even at Johns Hopkins you must get pushback, and maybe from professors at Johns Hopkins. Do you have any pushback within the facility?
That's a really fascinating area. And a lot of times the media, there's so much interest in this from the media, and they always want like a pro and a con. And they say, well, who's out there I can talk to that that's on the con side. And it really is interesting. I really don't know of anyone who's a legitimate expert who really thinks this research shouldn't be happening. Sometimes they come up with a well-meaning person that runs a drug, rehabilitation clinic, and that person says some things like, well, psychedelics can be dangerous. Yeah, we completely agree. It's not ready for prime time treatment yet, so more research needs to be done. Yeah, we completely agree. So they say kind of these obvious things, and there's really no difference in opinion. The range within the medical scientific research community ranges from, sounds kind of weird, it's not where I'm investing my time, but if it's done, gosh, you guys are doing it. You guys are the folks doing it well and doing it the way it needs to be done safely. And that from, oh my God, I've been waiting for someone to look at this stuff after 40 years, after the debacle decades ago. Thank goodness there's this growing, research, and keep going. So that's sort of the range. Because, if you're anywhere near an empiricist, how could you not be? I mean, we've demonstrated that you can, with the right mechanisms, you can do this research safely, and there's a whole lot of promise, to what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think to maybe add one thing on to the legalization question is that when we look globally at psychedelic substances, and let's take psilocybin, LSD, DMT, typically they're Schedule 1 or Schedule A, which is the highest possible schedule they could be in. What that means is there is a high risk of abuse and no medical use. And so by the amazing academic work that has been done, that is now being taken into large-scale, late-stage trials, once we have generated the evidence and once the FDA and the European Medicines Agency and the Canadian regulator approves, let's say, psilocybin for the treatment of depression, the substance needs to be rescheduled. There's no way around it because it doesn't fulfill the criteria anymore, because there is maybe still a high risk of abuse, depending on how you think about it, but at least there's a medical benefit that has been proven. So there's no way around keeping the substances where they are right now.
If I may jump in, if there's an interesting comparison with cannabis legalization versus what we're seeing south of the border. Canada, Justin Trudeau, a big grand plan of legalization, which technically now the Cannabis Act and the regs make cannabis more legal than it was under Prohibition. They've not even had the discussion about decriminalization, right? Whereas you're seeing Denver, Oakland, they're talking about decriminalization, because when you then decriminalize, you can then begin to adopt strategies that, if you truly are taking a public health and public approach to that, then you'll be able to do that in a way that makes sense. And so that's where I think there needs to be more work and consideration on that. Because again, decriminalize, then you can have rules that make sense. Because what we have in Canada with cannabis went from black market all the way down the curve and right back up to the side that I call corporate gangsterism. And so I think you avoid the corporate gangsterism by decriminalizing and then adopting laws and approaches and policies for that purpose.
There's a very important nuance between legalization and, especially kind of commercialized, cannabis shops style legalization and decriminalization. So a lot of folks in my field were kind of hesitant to weigh in at all on the Denver and on the Oakland initiatives, but I felt that I couldn't really bite my tongue on that. I mean, really through ethics. I mean, and I can speak as a scientist. We know scientifically there are tons of data that taking a strong criminal justice approach to treating the very real harms of drug use and addiction, like the data doesn't look good. Giving 20-year-olds felonies on their records, to minimize the use of psilocybin mushrooms, for example, not a good public health strategy. That's not to say that there aren't any dangers of particularly reckless use of these compounds, but we know there are severe racial disparities in the enforcement of these laws. We know data, taking parents away from their children is horrific for their long-term outcomes. So there is a science on this, in addition to just the human rights issues involved. That said, some of these initiatives will claim, oh, look at the work at Johns Hopkins and UCLA, et cetera, and therefore we need to decriminalize for medical use. And it's like, whoa, hold on. Our trials should not be encouraging use on their own. There are risks, and the benefit is not maximized. And so we want to send that message as well. So it's a nuanced message, but I do think, giving, and it typically is at least in the United States, it's a felony. Get caught with some mushrooms on a beach, and your entire life is changed. That is not a good public health approach, and so the data are behind saying, okay, we're just going to make that a very low public health priority, which is all that, for example, happened in Denver.
I would just want to make one point that I think clearly the decriminalization shows that there's a demand out there, right? That people want to use these substances to heal themselves. But I think there's also a cautionary tale here. And I think Michael Pollan actually made it, I believe, in an op-ed article in the New York Times, and I think the title was something along the lines of
Not so fast.
Not so fast, exactly. Not so fast. And I encourage everyone in the audience, if you are interested in the space, go read that op-ed and read his book, because it gives a very good background. But not so fast. As much as this is right now as a renaissance, it could soon become an apocalypse for this space. And we need to do it in a controlled manner, and we need to use rigorous science, and we need to do FDA clinical trials. And, even talking about recreational psychedelics just scares the hell out of me. I think it's the biggest existential threat to this space, and let's not squander the opportunity like generations past. Let's truly make this a renaissance.
Dr. McKenna, can you weigh in on that? Is there a place for recreational use?
Well, yes, I think there's, when you talk about legalization, we're not talking about, free access, selling these things out of vending machines or anything like that. There has to be a degree of regulation. The thing is, discussions, in my view, discussions about criminality, criminalization, and prohibition, they really have no place in this conversation. Because for one thing, when you talk about criminalization, are you criminalizing the substances? They were never criminal in the first place. The very idea is absurd that you could criminalize an organism. These are symbiotic partners with human beings, so that doesn't make any sense. The other problem historically has been, as Dr. Johnson pointed out, drug laws, prohibition laws are tools for social control, in a sense. You say the focus is on the substance. Actually, it's usually on human behavior, in particular socioeconomic sectors that for one reason or another are associated with particular drugs. So they're basically tools. The criminal approach to this is not about the substances. It's about marginalizing certain parts of the population that for one reason or another, the powers that be want to essentially keep their foot on, and so that whole approach just needs to go away, and I think another point that probably is worth saying is people are, they tend to take drugs like opiates and so on, or alcohol. These are people who are hurting, and it's an attempt at self-medication. An amateurish attempt that goes off track, but it's because, there's no compassion in our society toward people that have those problems. And I think psychedelics may change that whole conversation. That's my hope on the sociological level that will happen.
And do you see an existential threat that could push us backwards again? Anything? Because you must get approached by businesses left, right, and center asking you for advice, advisory, board positions, anything. What do you see in the sector that inspires you versus makes you a bit wary and cautious? For you, Dr. McKenna.
Question for you, Dennis. I guess what is it that, given the direction of where we're at with legalization and the commercialization, what is it that inspires you about that, or the direction?
Are you seeing activity that encourages you, and are you seeing activity that discourages you?
I think a point that maybe should be at least articulated is that with the legalization, with the integration of psychedelics into medicine, that's all wonderful, and these treatments are proving to be far better than anything there was before, and that's great. I think it's a mistake to think of them as medicines for sick people, in a sense, because Robert Jesse speaks eloquently about the betterment of the well. You know, these are substances that you do not have to have a mental disorder to benefit from. You know, Rick Doblin has made the point, people take psychedelics not to have a psychedelic experience, they take psychedelics to have a human experience. We're all part of this, these are tools to learn how to be better people.
And I'll make
and more compassionate people and wiser people and all of that, as they always have been in traditional societies. You know, it's not for nothing that indigenous people refer to these plants and substances as plant teachers. You know, we learn from them. We should respect them, not vilify them.
And
anyway.
Consistent with what you're saying, you know, our research, which was, you know, Bob Jesse, who you mentioned, like instigated our very first research for nearly 20 years. We've had a consistent thread at Hopkins. I showed you the clinical treatment data, but we've always run studies consistently on healthy normals, people without a diagnosable disorder, the betterment of the well. Right. Over a year later, people around them, spouses, coworkers, acquaintances, who have agreed to be part of our study say, yeah, this person is doing better. They're easier going. They're living a better life, you know?
And the family is happier and their friends are happier. And yeah, so it works on various levels. These medicines, I sometimes like to say, these are medicines for the soul, you know, and they can heal individuals, but also the collective soul. You know, and maybe even the planetary soul. And that's why these things are so completely revolutionary. Because potentially, and they've been co-evolutionary partners for God knows how long, and that process is still going on, and who knows how it will change us. But it seems to be that it will help us be better people. And people with more compassion for each other, for our environment, all of that. These are learning tools. How to learn how to be better people. And that I think is maybe the meta message, if you will.
Yeah, thank you. And Lars, after my conversations with you, I feel like you're quite aligned with what Dr. McKenna has said. So how do we get to that place where we have more free access, not just for medicinal and treatment use, but for somebody who just wants to go from good to good 2.0?
Yeah, maybe to briefly comment on what Dennis said. I think there's amazing research out of Canada by Gabor Mate looking at the causes of addiction, and I would really recommend to look into his work. It's amazing, his book in the realms of hungry ghosts, that you find trauma in every person that is addicted. And so if we can get to the underlying causes that cause addiction or depression, which are all just symptoms of, you know, an underlying traumatization, then we have a real solution. That's why I very much agree with what Dennis said. You know, at a global level, I said, you know, 1 in 4 people is suffering, and you know, those 1 in 4 people have a tremendous impact on our global society. And so, to answer your question, I would say it's leadership by example, right? We see the change, and Matt said it so eloquently. People recognize a change when someone has gone through a psychedelic experience, and we hear those stories from patients that go through our trials that are changed, and you know, the change in them coming out of depression after 20 years, that is taken into their families, and suddenly, you know, there's a father that's not locked in a room in a basement, but he comes out, he, you know, is present with the family, etc. if you have those stories at a global scale, then eventually legalization will be a very easy sell.
Okay, now I do want to allocate some time for questions. So please raise your hand, and I'm going to run a microphone out. We got one in the back.
Thank you so much, guys. Where do you see microdosing as an application, both in the clinical setting and then just on the day-to-day, feeling good 2.0?
So we're looking at MindMed quite closely at microdosing. I think I think there's a great application in the ADHD space, and hope to make some announcements on that soon. It's definitely, there's a lot of anecdotal data out there, but again, there's really never been some rigorous science on this particular subject, and so we want to invest the money to prove that it actually does work. So yeah, look forward for some announcements from us on that.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I agree. I think we need to work out for whom does microdosing really work, and I think that's an interesting question to look at a specific condition. I think there's a huge placebo effect, obviously, in psychedelics, and so that is something we need to try to control in the studies as far as that is possible. And I think I can comment on that. There has been a recent study with LSD by the University of Chicago that looked at the impact of LSD microdosing, and they did it in healthy normals, and what they found is actually for executive function, so acute problem solving, it's actually detrimental, because microdosing is a small trip. So we need to really look at for whom might microdosing be a solution.
I think there does need to be some more rigorous studies on microdosing. That's the thing, because you're using very low doses, that's the point, but then there's a fine line between microdose, the effect of that medication that way, and the placebo effect. And I think you have to do some pretty well-designed studies to determine if there really is an effect. And the other aspect of that is people shouldn't forget microdosing may be useful, but they should not forget that, if they boost the dose a little bit, just around the corner is a world of wonder that it might benefit folks to experience once in a while. I mean, you shouldn't use microdosing as an excuse for not having a full-on psychedelic experience,
Some of us have to work too.
Right.
So
I had a question. Go ahead. I have a question for you as a pharmacologist, but go on.
Just two studies, like it's been said. The only thing that's been shown so far is impairment, but there's a whole lot. You could argue they're not. Those studies weren't done in the ways that people are reporting, on an ongoing fashion every several days, that type of thing. There is some concern. People should be worried about mushrooms. Psilocybin hits a certain type of serotonin subtype of receptor that's been associated with the recall of some drugs for causing heart problems, fatalities. So we don't know what it's like to be taking a very small amount of psilocybin for decades. That's not the type of thing that we have seen with the use of these drugs. So you just got to be cautious. It's a model that hasn't been explored widely.
Yeah, and that was exactly what I was going to ask you about. That's valvular pathology, proliferation of the valvular tissue. Isn't that more of a risk for LSD than psilocybin? And that's one of the reasons why if you're going to microdose psilocybin, it's maybe a safer choice than LSD because of the way it binds into the receptor and kind of sits there. It does not dissociate easily like psilocybin does.
I think potentially, but there's so many unknowns between like the very low level mechanisms and the ultimate clinical outcome. And you have nonlinear effects and inverted U effects going on that you really don't know until you have the outcomes. People,
So
years and decades later.
Enough people have been microdosing. If you could put a study together on that, maybe the data is out there. If, what is the incidence of this cardiac side effect?
Right.
There must be some data on that now.
I mean, like vaping, It's like some of the earliest signs of,
exactly.
I mean, we're going to learn a lot in the next 20 years on that, So some things you just got to wait.
Okay, we have one more question from the audience here.
Hi guys. Something that I've been thinking about and sort of ties in with the conference here and this panel is Dennis had mentioned that LSD kind of dropped like a bomb onto society in the 60s, and there's another bomb that's about to be dropped onto society very soon, and that's AI. And I was wondering if anyone has done any work or has even just thought about, I think we're hitting an inflection point or a cross-sectionality where AI and psychedelics might sort of bump into each other. And I was wondering if anyone's done any work there or even had any crazy thoughts about that.
I'm doing work now in my lab using machine learning to examine large-scale surveys, the qualitative, the subjective narratives of psychedelic experiences, and sort of using AI in ways like that to examine, large psychedelic data sets. But I could imagine there's a bunch of ways that there could be an interaction. So that's one particular thing. No answers yet, but.
Yeah,
Okay, and I've got
that's a huge
Nikita.
question to raise in the 2 seconds left. But I think one thing about AI, a point I've often made to my colleagues is just in the abstract, if we want to understand consciousness, which is partly what psychedelics are good for, they're tools for exploring consciousness. AI may be as well, in the sense if you could build an AI system that is actually conscious in the way we understand consciousness, that's both a scary proposition and an exciting proposition, but chances are you'd learn a lot about consciousness if you could build one that is something that's conscious but not human. Just a wild speculation.
Just coming back to the discussion around AI, I think there's already a fair amount of drug discovery taking place with AI, and Lars knows a bit about that as well. So I think it's going to become more and more prevalent into the discovery side and designing new forms of medicine, whether it may be psychedelics or other medicines. But it's definitely going to play a critical role in our space and the pharmaceutical space in general in the future.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions. I have Nikita from Think Myco here who has a question for the panel.
How's it going, guys? This is a bit of a follow-up on the previous question from this gentleman. So here at Think Myco, we're looking at the next generation neurogenic drug development based on psychedelics. And one question in terms of the regulations, we get asked about the regulations. We're more worried about the knock-on effects later down the line. What happens in terms of bioethics when you start opening doors in the mind you didn't know existed, when you start peeking around corners, when the developing world has access to these, but the developed world has access to these, but underdeveloped countries can't afford to operate at a higher level of consciousness. What happens when you can consciously start affecting the central nervous system a little more granularly? All of these are real serious bioethics concerns for next generation neurogenetics. Do you guys have any thoughts on what that might look like in the future? Have you been thinking about that?
Well, I'll say that, I have yet to see out of 600 or 700 high dose psychedelic sessions, have yet to see really something that I don't think is qualitatively similar to what we see in just good psychotherapy, good behavioral treatment. I think it's possible we're drastically increasing the probability of the very salient beneficial effects, and rapidly advance, the whole thing, it's impossible to validate, but the whole thing, years of therapy packed into an afternoon, it's probably somewhat of an overstatement, but something like that, there is preparation and the integration, it's a process. So, but my larger point is that this is a risk of therapy. This is a risk of growth, of discovering yourself. This is a risk of getting older and a risk of life. But the point about there needs to be a mental health infrastructure to support people having these experiences, absolutely. Yeah.
Hey guys, thanks for doing this. I've been sober now for like 7 years, and I've kind of accredited that to a lot of 12-step work. But earlier this year, I was actually hiking in the same jungle that Dennis and Terrence in Colombia found mushrooms in the 70s, and I was really thinking back on my early experiences with psilocybin as a teenager, and was like, maybe that's had a bigger effect than I'd given it credit for. And I've really been on that train of thought lately, that it really opened my mind at a young age to get sober as like a daily drink or drug user. So how do you see psilocybin and other psychedelics maybe integrating with current addiction models?
I can talk just briefly on our view on psychedelics towards the addiction space, and I think there's a role for hallucinogenic therapies and trip-based models to coexist with psychedelic-inspired medicines, where maybe you need to open your mind and maybe you need to increase the neuroplasticity of your brain. But at the same time, there's something called Q-induced relapse, and if you've struggled with addiction, you would know that. It's when you see your favorite whiskey on the bar, or an opioid addict sees a bottle of OxyContin, you can snap. And that Q-induced relapse is what 18MC is really trying to address. And that's really, without going in a long-winded answer here, it's really dopamine in your brain, and that's what we're looking at modulating and regulating in your brain. So, I think there's a role for both types, but I'll let the others talk more on the clinic-based side.
Yeah, I think we need to explore all the models. If there's non-psychedelic varieties that could have a beneficial effect, my bets are probably those would likely be more short-term and would need to be perhaps taken on a more chronic basis, like traditional medications. But that needs to be explored. I do think I think some of the persisting effects that we're seeing, our evidence so far suggests that the nature of the subjective experience is predictive of long-term benefit. So it seems that having that conscious subjective experience, that the nature of that experience is part of the package, but we need to explore, I think in terms of integration with addiction, there's just every model out. I mean, we've learned a lot over the last 40 years since the first era. I combined the smoking cessation, the psilocybin with cognitive behavioral therapy. There are other things out there, motivational interviewing. There's so many treatment models that have empirical validation. Psychedelics can probably work well with a lot of them, and so we need to test all of these variations. It's an open field.
We sometimes say the real work begins after the session. It's what you handle, how you handle the insights, the information you got from the session. I think this is especially true of things like ibogaine. If a person is addicted, wants to take ibogaine therapy, whether it's successful or not will depend on what plans they've made to handle what happens the day after the session. If you just go back to your old habits, your old neighborhood, it's not going to work. You have to plan ahead. And I think that's true of a lot of these sessions. It's the integration that the psychedelics open you up and take you out of your reference frame. Sooner or later, you're going to be back in your reference frame, but hopefully in a more healthy way. So you're blowing up this default mode network, and then since it tends to equilibrium, it's going to fall back together. But it's kind of like rebooting your hard drive and getting rid of a lot of the kludge that accumulates, in your behavioral repertoire. It works more efficiently.
You have to establish a new. Absolutely. I see this is a window, a temporarily limited window of plasticity, and you have to establish a new normal during that time.
Exactly.
And then that becomes solidified.
Yeah. And this is not something that happens with a 10-minute visit with your therapist. That the problem is the medical model doesn't support this right now. It has to be completely changed.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I very much agree with that, and I think the possibility that you generate with the high dose experiences, you provide insight for the person, as you say, Dennis. You step out of your normal frame of reference, and you get some insight to the point of if we all agree, or if we can agree that there is trauma at the basis for addiction, and people can work on that trauma, and that is something that we see qualitatively in the studies that. Patients characterize the experience as 20 years of therapy within 6 hours, and so if they can have that insight, what is my trauma, and come out of it, and then afterwards, to your point, integrate it, and if we can work around therapy optimization, improve CBT or other therapies, and work with substances such as an 18-MMC or others that prolong maybe the neuroplasticity, and give people the opportunity to really work on themselves, to make the change, to keep them out of the addiction or the depression. I think then we have built a model, and there's not going to be just one solution. There's no magic bullet. All of them need to work together, and that's why it's so important that the academic research is being done, and that's why it's important that centers like Hopkins get financed to do all that work, to really find things out that we simply don't know. And I think that is something that excites me a lot about the space of psychedelics. Due to the prohibition, we lost a lot of time, and so we're still kind of, if you think about it, kind of in the late 60s, early 70s, and we will make a major findings in the space, things that we can't even think about. That haven't been found out, whereas all the other fields of in medicine have progressed a lot obviously over the 40 years, and psychedelic science has not. So there's a lot to be learned, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, there's a question here. Thank you so much for the panel. My question is a little bit from a different angle. With psilocybin or LSD or let's say ayahuasca, one big experience of these drugs is that experience of ego dissolution, that you feel this greatness, your perception is getting bigger, exponentially higher. And that's been my incentive to get into, getting the experience of psychedelics. So becoming when you're under effect, this selflessness, this being compassionate about everything else outside. So these are the effects that you get out of the psychedelics. And then when you're talking about you see that people are changed after. So this is coming from all this, whatever you're going through. So how do you see, now that we are developing this entrepreneurial ecosystem around, bringing psychedelics to more people, how do you see this different, from an angle of, let's say, selflessness versus getting into capitalism, funding, and all of that, which is kind of have been always. I'm sure there are selfless investors outside that they want to just push the science or push wellness for more people, but again, we have all those pushback from big pharma or people that are mostly focused on profit rather than what you get from the effect of psychedelics, what I'm going to say. So do you see this different? Do you see that we are developing a different entrepreneurial ecosystem for bringing psychedelics, or do you think that it's going to be another same?
I think I can answer that one. Basically, the two books that got me very interested in the psychedelic space going back to high school were actually both written by Aldous Huxley. First is The Doors of Perception and Brave New World. I would invite everybody in this room to read both and take note of the theme of Brave New World, where you have essentially the modern man of science on one hand, or person of science, created in a lab and so on. But then you also have the natural First Nations, those refer to the noble savage, which is probably an objectionable term, certainly now. But I think that's where we will see those two dichotomies, and we're seeing it even on the stage. You see clinical versus anthropologic and indigenous. And that's the theme at the end of Brave New World that they can't reconcile. And I think truly that will need to be reconciled as we progress forward on this new renaissance, because ultimately that is where There's the ancient wisdom, the ancient knowledge, the plant medicine, the natural connection with earth. But what's missing is the standards, the lab, the certification. And I think that's the challenge that I see is maybe, well, my business model will be how to reconcile those two themes. But that's, in a way, to answer your question, the way to possibly sum it up from my end. What do you think?
What? I didn't hear it.
Oh, you didn't hear? Jump in, Matthew. What do you?
I guess I'm not quite, just kind of the idea is the commercialization going to look different here than in other areas of developing medicine? I guess that was the take home. I don't know. Well, I'm an academic, so I might be the worst to actually, address the question. But, generally, from my perspective, it's like, oh, now, especially within the last year, wow, where do all these people come from? I was just doing this because I thought it was the most fascinating thing in the world 15 years ago. My take home is these are good problems to have, and there's always going to be good actors and bad actors, and you can always point to people in the nonprofit sphere generally that are doing good things and bad things. Same thing in the commercial sphere. So, like the rest of life, you have to have some wisdom and look what folks are doing. And but things are kind of blowing up, and there's a lot of interest. And if we're onto something, that's going to happen. So this is a good thing.
I think it's interesting that Rob mentioned 2 books by Huxley, but I think a third one is worth mentioning, and that's Island. And Island is kind of the opposite of Brave New World. Island is about a society in which a sacred psychedelic, obviously a mushroom of some kind, is integrated into the society. It's also worth reading. It's an example of how things could be if we learn how to approach the use of these subjects.
And when I first met Dennis, that's exactly, he said, well, you haven't read The Island. And that's exactly what I did next.
Well, I'm not a big proponent. I mean, it's the neglected book by Huxley. I think more people could read it because it shows, how it might work.
Yeah, I very much agree. One of my all-time favorite books is Island. To comment on your point, I think there is no way around investment in this space. There's no other way to do this because, any study that we're running from the regulatory side costs more than the funding that Hopkins has received for the next 5 years. So for us to develop psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression will cost us 200 to 300 million. And any other indication, and I believe that psilocybin is lends itself to be a treatment for many of the mood disorders. Any other indications will cost the same. So if we want to develop psilocybin for 5 indications, that means we will have to spend between $1 billion and $1.5 billion in capital. And so it's really hard to do that as a non-profit. And I admire my friend Rick Doblin, who has done tremendous work at MAPS with MDMA. And keeps doing that, and I'm pretty sure he will be successful and take it to market for PTSD, but it has taken him 30 years to do that. And so I hope that for the next generation of treatments, we can be a bit quicker.
All right, and unfortunately, guys, we're out of time, but I'm going to make sure I wrangle all of my panelists into the lounge where we're throwing a light reception, and there's an open bar out there for about another half an hour or so. Thank you so much for joining me on stage and at this conference. Please give them a big round of applause, guys. And that concludes the Extraordinary Future Conference 2019. Thank you so much for coming out, and I hope to see you next year.